Welcome back for another book review. Today we are talking about Circle Round, Raising Children in Goddess Traditions by Starhawk, Diane Baker, and Anne Hill. So this is one of those books that was recommended in a very long ago defunct video from Charming Pixie Flora, and I bought it at that time. So this book was one of those recommendeds, especially if you have pagan kids, or you are pagan and you're raising your kids in our tradition opposed to either nothing, letting them figure it out on their own, or in a more generic context, which for the majority of Americans is going to be Christian. Instead, this is if you want to raise your kids in varying levels of paganism, whether you want it just a little bit here and there, or you want to have a lot of different ideas. They have quite a number of kind of more like level 1, level 2, level 3 of pagan to their crafts and recipes and stuff like that. Some of these are like not going to raise too much of a question from your neighbors, and if they tell their friends, it's not really going to bring up much. Other parts of it definitely will. And it's kind of your call on how you want to go about that, how much you want to have your kids to know, and stuff like that. So this book is definitely aimed at the parents who have some background knowledge on paganism, but need to have ideas of how to make it like kid-friendly. And I know there are more books out there since this came out, but this was kind of the first one really that I've found for this topic. And honestly, it's a very good resource to have. Is it how I would personally go about a lot of this stuff? Probably not, but it gives you a lot of ideas. And honestly, I do think it depends on your kids as well and their personalities. Thinking of my nieces and nephew, like over the years, some of the stuff would have worked better than others. And it just kind of comes down to how your kids and your household would run, especially for some of the crafts and stuff like that. Like, I know some of them would work great with, like, some of the nieces and nephews and others really wouldn't. So it kind of depends on the kids that are going to be involved. So basically how this book is set up, there's a number of different information. The majority of this book is centered around the Wheel of the Year. There's a little bit on the elements and then kind of the rites of passage, life events that happen. So for the Wheel of the Year, it starts off with a brief summary of what the holiday is. Then we go into the goddess, the god, and then what's happening in nature. Now, obviously, this is the Goddess Traditions book, so it's going to have very much a Wiccan-based thing. So the goddess, where she never actually gets to rest, really, because she is a crone, and then she's giving birth, and then she's taking care of her toddler, and then suddenly she's the spring maiden, and then she's getting married, and then she's pregnant again, and then she's super pregnant, and then her husband dies, and then he's born again. So she never really gets a break. That story of the Wheel of the Year. And then the god gets born, lives, dies, gets reborn. That is the Wheel of the Year. There's nothing really else to it, so do keep that in mind. Because personally, that's not the story that I would be teaching my kids, but that's up to the individual parents. So then it goes into a lot of different ideas for each of the Sabbats. So you have recipes, craft ideas, and honestly, there's just so much of different things that you can be doing. And it's not necessarily all in one day, but just ways to celebrate throughout the season, really. And honestly, like, it's such a good resource. Even if you don't use everything in the book, it just gives you ideas of what to do. And like, some of the recipes really look interesting. And of course, being kid-friendly, they're not going to be terribly crazy recipes. So I'm quite excited to try a number of them and see. And if you happen to pick up this book and you were part of the YouTube like pagan community back in like 2009 to 2011 or so, some of these might sound kind of familiar, and that's because it really seems like a lot of them came from Charming Pixie Flora's channel, or I should say she got her ideas for her channel from this book, because I'm pretty sure the book came out first. But she kind of took a number of them. I think she tweaked them a little bit, but it's like, oh, that's where you got the idea from. Okay, similar to Celebrating the Great Mother that I talked about a while ago. Kind of the same thing. So honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It is nice to have that little remembrance of her channel in whatever ways we can. That was the first person that I took on as a mentor and really used her channel as like my learning platform. And a lot of people did as well at that time. And so it's always nice when we can see just little remnants of it here and there, because she has once again taken down her channel, which is why I never link it below, because there's no sense. It might be there, it might not be. She's done it quite a few times. She will bring it all back and then take it all down. But this book has a lot of the ideas that she had initially talked about. And again, she changed some of the things, but for the most part, the basic concepts are still found in this book. So if you remember her channel back in the day and now you have kids, or you're planning on having kids, and you're like, ah, crap, what were those things? This book has a lot of ideas that she had talked about on her channel, and also a bunch more. I was pleasantly surprised to see that there were a few mentions of the Norse. Again, that's the pantheon I like. And there wasn't a lot, and some of them, like, I disagreed with. You know, when you have people that don't really work with the Norse deities to try and include them, you know, you take what you can get. You know, there's probably better mother figures than, like, Freya, because, like, if you look at the myths, Frigg is probably the better option, unless you're including them as the one. Like, certain things like that. But in one of the stories, there was, towards the end of the book, in the life events section, there was the story of Skadi and Njord, who, she is the, like, mountain giant goddess. She's like snow, mountains, wolves, all of that jazz. And he is the warm beach, beautiful blue ocean, like, palm trees and sunshine. And they, in this book, they kind of summarize the tale of how they ended up with, like, how they got there was, like, just gently skirting around that whole story of why, but nonetheless, it's for kids. So, just, like, casually, like, ah, yeah, we killed your dad, it's fine. But, like, do you want a husband? And, like, how Loki got her to laugh. Like, you know, when they get older, they can learn all of the joys that is Loki. But, so they talk about that myth, and I was really surprised that they used that as a good example of how divorce sometimes is necessary. Because if you don't know the myth, she ends up having to pick through a long tail. The basic is she ends up picking her husband based off of his feet, because she thought she was going to be picking the beautiful, gorgeous god, Balder. However, it wasn't his feet that were the clean, pretty ones. It was the god of the ocean, the sea. And that's Njord. And so she picked him. And then they were like, in this story for Circle Round, they were like, you know what? Actually, not that bad. So they had a good relationship, but neither liked where the other one was at. And I loved the way they described it in here. Like, the sunlight glinting off of the water for Skadi being like, God, it's so bright, and the seagulls wake me up all the time. And he's going up to the mountains, and he's like, it's freaking cold all the time, the wolves are howling all night. And eventually they decide, like, it's not gonna work. We just aren't compatible, and we should split while we still like each other before we end up hating each other and having a lot of resentment. And they used that as a good story for approaching the idea of divorce. And I thought that was pretty cool, honestly. So then, the other parts of the book, it kind of ends with going through the kind of life process of having kids. Honestly, I was pretty bummed that the majority of this was really focused on having your biological kids, and there was just little things here and there, teensy bits, for adoption, and that was about it, which honestly kind of sucked. Because there is such an emphasis throughout the book on a mother's ability to birth her own children, and as somebody who can't do that, or if I do, I would die from it, so it's off the table for me, like, it's just a bit alienating, and how it's like all of the rituals really revolve around that. Like, oh, when you decide you want to get pregnant, here's these things to do. Oh, here's the thing to do to, you know, get you through your pregnancy. And when you go into labor, and it's like, cool, how does that apply for adoptive moms and adoptive dads? Just the little things that honestly I think modern books tackle the topic better, because we try to be more aware of more people and more outside of the average norm and try and include more people. I feel like since this book has been published, the world has definitely pushed a lot for more inclusivity, and that includes adoptive parents and foster parents and non-traditional parents, where it might be single parent, it could be same-sex parents, and, like, there's not really any of that in here. There's, like, teensy tiny mentions, but then it's like, oh, but then save the umbilical cord and give it to them when they're 18, which I don't think I would want, but, you know, to each their own. And then it also talks about, like, well, you know, plant a tree with your placenta in the ground underneath it to nourish it for your baby, and, like, to have that tree represent your kid. And it's like, that's cool, but also, like, as an adoptive parent, that would be weird to be like, hey, so I know you're having a kid right now, and we're gonna take it from you. can we have the other organ that comes out too? Like, that's weird. You can't, that's not something you're probably gonna ask. Just little things like that. I wish there was a little bit more. One question that me and my husband had actually been talking about, and this book didn't answer, is for girls, we have a very definitive moment where you could truly say your shift from childhood into, like, puberty and teenage years really starts, and that's when you get your period. And especially, like, your body starts to develop, but really, your period is the beginning. There really isn't one for boys. And me and my husband were like, I don't know how you would exactly pick. Would you do like what some cultures do, where you just pick a, like, just random age, basically, and be like, yeah, that's, like, kind of close enough? Or would you pick, like, a specific time? Like, it's not really discussed. And in this book, it's kind of brushed over a lot for what goes on for boys compared to girls. And I think that does come down to the fact that it's moms with mostly daughters, and it's, again, focused on the goddess, and it's just a lot of feminine focus, which isn't bad, but as someone who, I mean, we obviously don't have a son, but, like, it's just one of those things that I wish they had a little bit more information. And it kind of ends there, and I wish there'd been a little bit more on, like, the rest of life journeys. Like, it ends on, which I also feel like they could have handled a little bit better, and that was the topic of having sex, like talking about picking condoms and STDs, which I think are now called STIs. But, like, there's a number of things that they talk about. But they also kind of, like, didn't mention how it's, like, there is an appropriate age to probably start that. They didn't really talk about that, and they also talked about, like, well, just do, like, one of the things, which, I don't know, I try and be a little open-minded, but sometimes things catch you. They actively were kind of promoting, instead of having intercourse, to have outer course. And they're like, well, you can use your hands and your mouth, and I'm like, that you can still get diseases. Having worked in a doctor's office, you can get a lot of diseases in other parts of your body without having those two bits touching. Just touching down there on anybody. So, probably not the greatest advice. And of course, there really wasn't a huge emphasis on, again, the inclusivity that we talk about now, of talking about various genders and sexualities, and to realize that you might fall one way, you might fall another way, and that's perfectly fine. It's natural, it's normal. You know, kind of preparing them for that. And there is definitely a slight emphasis on what their activism is throughout the book. They're definitely all organic. You need to be a little bit of an activist, feminist, you need to go and fight for the planet, stuff like that. And so if that bothers you, you might not like this book. It's not too much, but it's definitely recommended throughout everywhere. So overall, this is a good resource to have. There's nothing that I would probably use verbatim except maybe some of the recipes just to try them. But between that and Celebrating the Great Mother, it does give you a nice broad idea of some things to include for having your kids raised as pagans. So anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments down below. Huge thank you to my patrons. I'll have their names here on the screen. If you'd like to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/knightwillowcrafts. Make sure to like and subscribe. I post every single day, and until next time, thank you so much for watching, and blessed be.